Number 1. Carly Gregg. She was only 14 years old, but the moment investigators reviewed the home security footage, the case shattered any illusion that this was a tragic misunderstanding. What they saw was a teenager acting with chilling calculation inside her family's home in Brandon, Mississippi, and it instantly became one of the most widely discussed juvenile murder cases of 2024. Carly Gregg grew up in a blended family. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, was a respected 40-year-old math teacher at Northwest Rankin High School, where Carly attended as a ninth-grade student. Her stepfather, Heath Smiley, worked as a physical therapist nearby. Colleagues described Ashley as patient, structured, and deeply dedicated. At home, friends said the relationship between Ashley and her daughter had become strained in the months leading up to the incident. Behind closed doors, tension had been building. Carly had been struggling with mental health issues including mood swings, self-harm, eating disorders, and claims of hearing voices. She'd been prescribed medications like Zoloft and Lexapro, and the family had tried equine therapy to help. There had been minor warning signs. She'd brought a Swiss Army knife to school and had been caught circumventing phone restrictions. But nothing suggested the violence about to unfold. There were no major prior violent events, no criminal history, and no obvious warning that she would cross such an extreme line. The turning point came on March 19, 2024. Earlier that day, one of Carly's friends became so worried about her marijuana use and possession of burner phones that he told Ashley. When mother and daughter arrived home from school at 3:54 that afternoon, Ashley immediately searched Carly's room and found exactly what had been reported: marijuana, vape pens, and burner phones. What happened next was captured in horrifying detail by the home's kitchen surveillance camera. At 4:14 in the afternoon, Carly walked toward her mother's bedroom with something held behind her back, carefully positioning herself so the camera couldn't see what she was carrying. It was a .357 Magnum revolver that Ashley kept hidden beneath her bed. The bedroom had no cameras, but the audio was unmistakable. 3 gunshots in rapid succession. Ashley Smiley was shot 3 times in the head and died from her injuries. Carly returned to the kitchen, the gun still concealed, while the family's dog circled her anxiously. She ignored them, picked up her mother's phone, and began texting. Using Ashley's phone, she sent Heath a message. "Are you almost home, honey?" It was designed to lure him back without suspicion, but Carly didn't stop there. She sent another text to a different friend, claiming it was an emergency. When that friend arrived, Carly asked a chilling question. "Have you ever seen a dead body?" She then led them to the bedroom and showed them Ashley's body. According to the friend's testimony, Carly was holding the gun and said something that revealed her full intent. "I've got 3 more waiting for my stepdad, 2 to the head, 1 to the chest." At 5:03 in the afternoon, Heath arrived home. The moment he opened the kitchen door, shots rang out. He was hit in the shoulder but managed to wrestle the gun away from Carly. Heath later testified that she suddenly looked terrified out of her mind, with eyes really big, as if she had seen a demon. She screamed and ran from the house. Rankin County deputies found her half a mile away sitting in a field. The investigation moved quickly. Complete surveillance footage, text messages, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and ballistics painted an undeniable picture. Prosecutors also discovered Carly had hidden one of the security cameras in the refrigerator after the shooting. Mississippi law allows juveniles to be charged as adults in the most severe cases, and this met every threshold. Carly was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutors offered a plea deal, 40 years for murder, with the other charges dropped. Her defense team rejected it twice, believing they had a stronger defense: insanity. The trial began September 16, 2024, and lasted 5 days. The question wasn't whether Carly committed the crimes. The video made that undeniable. The question was whether she was legally insane and therefore not criminally responsible. Dr. Andrew Clark, a child psychiatrist, testified that Carly suffered from bipolar II disorder, had been hearing voices since age 6, and claimed no memory of the shooting. But forensic psychiatrist Dr. Jason Pickett countered that Carly didn't meet Mississippi's legal standard for insanity. She understood what she was doing and knew it was wrong. The prosecution presented devastating evidence. In February, Carly had texted a friend saying, "You don't understand how psycho I was that day. I almost murdered my parents." She'd retrieved a specific weapon, sent carefully crafted texts, invited a friend to see the body, and described her plan for the stepfather in detail. When Dr. Clark was asked on cross-examination, "If you try and cover up a crime, doesn't that indicate you know what you did?" He had to answer yes. The courtroom fell silent. Carly's therapist testified she'd seemed emotionally stable the day before. Her biological father refused to cooperate with the defense and stated bluntly, "That girl knew right from wrong." Even Heath, who still cared deeply for Carly and mouthed "I love you" to her during trial, couldn't change what the evidence proved. On September 20th, 2024, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Carly guilty on all counts. After another hour, they recommended life without parole. Carly Gregg was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences plus 10 years for tampering with evidence. For a 15-year-old, it meant spending the rest of her life behind bars. District Attorney Bubba Bramlett stated, "Carly Gregg is evil. That's not easy to say, but sometimes evil comes in young packages." The case forced uncomfortable questions about juvenile accountability, mental health in the justice system, firearm access, and whether a 14-year-old can be held to adult standards. How young is too young for life without parole? What role should mental illness play? And how do we prevent tragedies that unfold behind closed doors? Carly's story is one of the most disturbing examples of a teen whose mental health struggles, planning, and access to weapons collided in the worst possible way. The surveillance footage that captured her calculated actions that afternoon has been viewed millions of times, leaving people struggling to understand how someone so young could commit such a cold-blooded crime. Next is a case where a teenager didn't act out of family conflict or crisis, but out of a self-described desire to see what it felt like, a motive that stunned the nation and became one of Missouri's most unsettling crimes. Number 2, Alyssa Bustamante. Before the crime, Alyssa Bustamante looked like almost any other 15-year-old in rural Missouri. She lived with her grandparents, went to church youth groups, drew attention for her blue-dyed hair, and struggled with depression and self-harm. But behind that outward image was a deeper instability that no one around her imagined would escalate into one of the most shocking teenage murder cases in U.S. history. Alyssa's upbringing was fractured. Her parents battled addiction and legal issues, and she was raised primarily by her grandparents, who provided stability, but couldn't fully reach her emotionally. School records and journals later revealed a teenager fighting internal chaos, chronic depression, anxiety, and a fascination with death. None of this, however, suggested she was capable of calculated violence. That's what made the case so disturbing. There was no obvious turning point. Instead, the buildup happened internally, out of sight. The shift toward the crime began weeks before the murder. Investigators later discovered 2 pre-dug graves behind her house, a sign she had been planning something long before anyone realized it. Alyssa spoke openly online about feeling numb, disconnected, and desperate for a sense of control. That emotional void became the backdrop for what she would eventually do. On October 21st, 2009, Alyssa walked out into her neighborhood and targeted 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, a girl who lived just a few houses away. Elizabeth was cheerful, well-liked, and timid, the kind of child who always came home on time. That day, Alyssa lured her into the woods, strangled her, stabbed her, and buried her in a shallow grave. For police, it was one of the most chilling juvenile crimes they had ever handled, not only for the brutality, but the motive Alyssa would later admit. When investigators questioned her, Alyssa confessed. But the most disturbing detail came from her own diary. The entry described the murder in cold, detached language and ended with a line that shocked the courtroom. It was amazing. She later scribbled out that line, but prosecutors had already captured it. This wasn't a crime born out of anger, retaliation, or fear. It was, in Alyssa's own words, something she wanted to do to see what it felt like. Prosecutors argued that this revealed a level of premeditation far beyond typical juvenile offenses. The 2 pre-dug graves supported that conclusion. So did online posts showing she had been slipping deeper into dark fantasies long before the murder. The investigation moved quickly. Hundreds of volunteers searched the woods, and when Elizabeth's body was found, the entire town went into shock. Missouri authorities charged Alyssa as an adult almost immediately. Her age, 15, didn't reduce the severity of the case. The evidence was overwhelming, and the motive was inexplicable. In court, the prosecution focused on 3 pillars. Alyssa lured the victim intentionally. She prepared burial sites ahead of time. Her own diary documented her emotional reaction after the killing. The defense pointed to her mental health issues, arguing she was a severely troubled teenager rather than a hardened criminal. But even with that context, the sheer planning behind the crime made leniency impossible. Faced with the possibility of life without parole, Alyssa accepted a plea deal in 2012. She was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for armed criminal action. Missouri law required tough sentencing, but the court acknowledged her age by allowing a theoretical chance of release, though in practice, parole is far from guaranteed. For the public, this case became a benchmark for discussing juvenile crime. It forced difficult questions about mental health, adolescent impulsivity, and the limits of rehabilitation. But it also revealed a harsh truth. Some crimes committed by teens show levels of planning and emotional detachment that resemble adult offenders more than children. Alyssa Bustamante's case still circulates online because it is one of the few crimes committed by a minor where the motive wasn't hidden, confused, or reactive. It was explicitly stated by the offender, and that clarity made it even more disturbing. Next is a case involving another 14-year-old, one whose crime happened not in a home or neighborhood, but inside a school, a place meant to be safe, and it led to one of Massachusetts' most infamous murder trials. Number 3, Philip Chism. On the surface, he looked like the quiet new kid, a 14-year-old freshman who had just transferred to Danvers High School in Massachusetts. But within weeks of arriving, Philip Chism committed one of the most shocking crimes in the state's history, turning a school building into the scene of a homicide that stunned teachers, parents, investigators, and the entire nation. Chism had recently moved from Tennessee to Massachusetts with his mother. Teachers described him as introverted but polite. He played soccer, kept to himself, and didn't cause trouble. But classmates noticed something deeper, a detachment, a distance that made him hard to read. While many teens struggle after relocating, Philip's internal state was far more fractured. He was dealing with depression, isolation, and personal stress at home. No one around him fully grasped how unstable he had become. The turning path in this case emerged on a seemingly normal October day in 2013. Philip attended math class with teacher Colleen Ritzer, a 24-year-old beloved by students for her kindness, patience, and upbeat personality. She noticed he seemed upset and quietly asked if he was okay. It was a simple attempt at compassion, but something in that moment triggered him. After school, Chism followed her into a girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. There were no witnesses, but security cameras captured the lead-up and aftermath. Prosecutors later revealed what happened inside. Chism attacked and killed Colleen Ritzer, then assaulted her body. The crime was deliberate, planned within minutes, and committed inside a school hallway just steps away from where students and staff were still moving around. The aftermath showed chilling composure. Chism dragged Colleen's body out of the bathroom using a recycling bin, pushing it past cameras as if he were completing a routine task. He brought her to a wooded area behind the school and concealed her. Then he walked home, retrieved a change of clothes, and went to watch a movie at a nearby mall. When police found him hours later, he had Colleen's credit cards and a box cutter, the weapon used in the attack. From an investigative standpoint, the case was airtight. Danvers High's security cameras documented his movements step by step. His backpack contained evidence tying him directly to the murder. A handwritten note found in his possession added an even darker dimension, a brief, disturbing message about the killing that offered no explanation, only confirmation. The courtroom phase focused on Philip's state of mind. The defense argued severe mental illness, specifically psychosis. Experts described symptoms of depression, dissociation, and detachment. But the prosecution countered with a clear, fact-based argument. His actions showed intention and awareness. He planned the attack, concealed the body, disposed of evidence, and attempted to flee. The legal question wasn't whether he had emotional struggles, many teens do, but whether those struggles rendered him unaware of his actions. The evidence showed they did not. In 2016, Philip Chism was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, the maximum allowed under Massachusetts law for a juvenile offender. the judge also added additional sentences for aggravated rape and armed robbery, ensuring he would remain behind bars for decades. The impact of this case went far beyond the courtroom. Schools across the country reevaluated security protocols, staff training, and hallway monitoring. Teachers questioned how a student could appear so quiet, yet harbor such violent impulses. Parents struggled with a painful question: how do you detect danger in someone so young? Chism's crime is remembered not just because of his age, but because it happened in a place meant to be safe. It showed that extreme violence can emerge without long histories of behavioral issues, and that even a brief emotional break in a vulnerable teen can have catastrophic consequences when opportunities and access align. Next is a case involving another teen who lived in a tight-knit religious household, yet carried out an attack that left not one victim, but an entire family dead. A crime that shocked New Mexico and raised enduring questions about adolescent violence. Number 4. Nehemiah Griego. When investigators entered the Griego home in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they immediately realized they were dealing with one of the most devastating family homicides in state history. The person responsible wasn't an adult intruder or a stranger with a motive. It was a 15-year-old boy who had grown up inside that very house. Nehemiah Griego was raised in a deeply religious, structured household. His father, Greg Griego, was a former pastor and a well-known figure in Albuquerque's evangelical community. Outwardly, the family seemed stable. Inside the home, Nehemiah had responsibilities, routines, and parents who believed they were raising him with strong values. But beneath the surface, he struggled with depression, anger, and fantasies of violence that no one in the family fully understood. Friends later said Nehemiah felt isolated, overshadowed, and disconnected from his siblings. But there was no clear trigger that predicted what happened next. This crime didn't stem from a long pattern of violent behavior. Instead, it came from a teen whose internal world had deteriorated quietly and dangerously. On January 19, 2013, Nehemiah took one of the family's firearms and approached his mother, Sarah Griego, who was home with the children. He shot and killed her, then turned the gun on his younger siblings, a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old. These were children who trusted him completely. The killings were deliberate and occurred one by one. Hours later, Nehemiah waited for his father to return from a ministry event. When Greg walked into the house, Nehemiah shot and killed him as well. 5 victims, every member of his immediate family gone. After the murders, Nehemiah didn't flee. Instead, he changed into clean clothes, grabbed the family's van, and went to spend time with his girlfriend and friends. He talked casually about wanting to run away or join the military. At one point, he even showed a photo of his dead mother to a friend, who immediately contacted authorities. Police arrived at the home shortly after and discovered the full crime scene. From the beginning, the case was defined by the chilling contrast between Nehemiah's age and the scale of the violence. Investigators found no evidence of a sudden explosion of anger. He had methodically killed each family member, waited, and killed again. That level of deliberation made it clear this wasn't an impulsive act. It was planned. In the legal phase, prosecutors argued that Nehemiah understood exactly what he was doing. They highlighted his calm behavior after the murders, the conversations he had with peers, and the steps he took to continue with his day. The defense pushed in the opposite direction, pointing to trauma, emotional instability, depression, and a long-standing fascination with violent scenarios. Psychological experts described him as a teen with impaired judgment and internal turmoil, but not someone detached from reality. The hearings lasted years, partly because the U.S. juvenile sentencing landscape shifted during this period. Supreme Court rulings limited mandatory life sentences for minors, forcing states to reassess how they sentenced young offenders. But even under revised standards, the severity of this crime placed it among the rare cases where courts concluded rehabilitation was unlikely. In 2019, after lengthy hearings and evaluations, Nehemiah Griego was effectively sentenced to life in prison with long-term review conditions that still keep him behind bars for decades. The ruling balanced his young age with the sheer scale and intentionality of the crime. The case left New Mexico stunned. A religious community lost a pastor, a mother, and 3 young children. Schools and churches struggled to understand how a teenager living in a structured home could carry out a massacre without warning signs visible to the outside world. The crime also renewed debate about access to firearms in households with troubled teens, and how mental health issues can go unnoticed, even in families that appear loving and disciplined. The Griego murders are still studied because they are rare, a juvenile mass family homicide committed with planning, patience, and emotional distance. It forced courts, scholars, and families across the country to confront uncomfortable questions about adolescent violence and the thin line between internal struggles and catastrophic outcomes. Next is a case involving a 16-year-old whose story went viral years later, not because of traditional motives, but because of national debates over trafficking, self-defense, and justice. A case that became one of Tennessee's most controversial convictions. Number 5. Cyntoia Brown. Her case began like a standard homicide investigation in Tennessee. It ended as a national debate involving prosecutors, governors, celebrities, and millions of people questioning whether a 16-year-old girl should carry a life sentence for a killing she said was an act of survival. The story of Cyntoia Brown is one of the most polarizing juvenile cases of the 2000s because it sits directly at the crossroads of criminal law, exploitation, and public perception. Cyntoia grew up in a turbulent environment. Her biological mother struggled with addiction and alcohol, and Cyntoia experienced trauma and instability from a young age. By her teens, she was frequently running away, drifting between homes, and interacting with older men who took advantage of her. She eventually ended up under the control of a man known as Cutthroat, who was violent, armed, and controlling. He trafficked her, exploited her vulnerabilities, and kept her under constant threat. This backdrop is essential. It doesn't erase what happened, but it explains the mindset of a 16-year-old navigating a world dominated by violence, exploitation, and survival instincts. The turning path began on August 6, 2004. A 43-year-old real estate agent named Johnny Allen picked Cyntoia up and brought her to his home. Brown later stated she feared he was reaching for a gun and believed she was in imminent danger. Prosecutors argued the opposite. They said she shot him while he was asleep and then fled with his money and guns. What happened in that bedroom remains disputed to this day. What's not disputed is that Cyntoia fired a single shot, killing Allen. Her arrest came quickly. She confessed, but her explanation, fear of being harmed, was complicated by the fact that she also took Allen's wallet and firearms. Prosecutors viewed this as evidence of robbery, turning the case into a felony murder scenario. Under Tennessee law at the time, that combination meant automatic life in prison. The courtroom battle was fierce. The prosecution emphasized planning, flight, and theft. The defense emphasized trauma, exploitation, and the survival responses of a trafficked minor. But in 2006, the jury sided with the state. Cyntoia was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery, and the judge imposed a life sentence, with parole eligibility pushed decades into the future, long after most people would be past middle age. For years, the case stayed relatively quiet. She remained in prison, earning a GED and later a college degree. But everything changed in 2017 when a short documentary clip and social media posts reframed the narrative. Suddenly, millions of people looked at her case through the lens of trafficking, abuse, and the question of whether a teenager could genuinely be expected to respond rationally while being exploited. Celebrities, activists, and high-profile figures pushed the governor to take action. The national conversation shifted from, was this murder, to should a trafficked minor be sentenced like an adult with no meaningful chance at rehabilitation? These debates weren't about excusing what happened, but about whether the sentence reflected justice or outdated legal standards. In 2019, after nearly 15 years in prison, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted clemency. Cyntoia was released later that year. She had already served the equivalent of a lengthy adult sentence, and her conduct inside prison, education, counseling, rehabilitation, played a significant role in the public support she gained. Her case became a turning point in how states discussed juvenile sentencing, trauma-informed justice, and the legal treatment of minors who commit crimes while being exploited. Today, Cyntoia works in criminal justice reform, using her story to highlight gaps in the system and the realities of trafficking. Her case remains controversial, Because two truths sit side by side. A man lost his life. A 16-year-old victim of exploitation faced adult punishment without consideration of her circumstances. That duality is why this case still sparks debate nearly 2 decades later, and it leads us into another modern teen case that drew national attention, not for exploitation, but for pre-planned violence inside a high school, a crime that changed Michigan law and made headlines for months. Number 6, Ethan Crumbley. When the shooting at Oxford High School unfolded on November 30th, 2021, the first assumption was the same one investigators make in almost every school tragedy. An armed student acted alone, and the legal responsibility would fall squarely on that teen. What no one expected was that this case would turn into one of the most significant legal experiments in modern American criminal law. Because for the first time in U.S. history, prosecutors didn't stop at the shooter. They charged the parents as well. But everything began long before that day. Inside the home life and psychological decline of a 15-year-old boy named Ethan Crumbley. Ethan lived with his parents, James and Jennifer, in Oxford, Michigan. Outwardly, the family looked ordinary. They lived in a suburban home, had financial struggles, but nothing extreme, and Ethan attended school regularly. But his internal world told a very different story. Journal entries, text messages, and drawings later showed a teen slipping deeper into anxiety, paranoia, and violent ideation. He wrote about hearing voices. He wrote about feeling abandoned. He wrote about wanting to commit violence. None of this reached school officials with full clarity until it was too late. The turning path accelerated in the days leading up to the shooting. 4 days before the attack, Ethan's parents bought him a Sig Sauer 9mm handgun, calling it his early Christmas present. Social media posts showed Ethan posing with it, and his parents encouraged the excitement. The gun was kept in an unlocked drawer. Ammunition was easily accessible, but the real warning signs came at school. On November 29th, a teacher caught Ethan searching online for ammunition during class. His mother didn't reprimand him. Instead, she texted him, "LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught." That message became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. The very next morning, another teacher discovered something far worse, a disturbing drawing on Ethan's desk. The sketch showed a gun, a bullet, a bleeding figure, and phrases like, "The thoughts won't stop, help me." The school immediately called Ethan's parents in for a meeting. Administrators urged them to take him home and get him immediate mental health support. The Crumbleys refused. They didn't check his backpack. They left the school without him. This meeting, a window of intervention that could have prevented everything, lasted just 30 minutes. 2 hours later, Ethan walked into a school restroom, took the handgun from his backpack, and began shooting. He killed 4 students, Tate Meyer Madison Baldwin, Hannah St. Juliana, Justin Schilling. He wounded 7 others, including a teacher. The attack lasted minutes, but its impact reshaped Michigan and triggered one of the most far-reaching legal debates of the decade. Ethan surrendered without resisting. His demeanor shocked officers, calm, quiet, emotionless. When investigators reviewed his journal, they found entries admitting he planned the shooting. He described wanting to commit violence and resenting his parents for ignoring him. His writings also confirmed the gun was intentionally brought to school, not an impulse, but a decision. Prosecutors charged him as an adult with murder and terrorism. The terrorism charge was unprecedented for a school shooter, but reflected the fear and trauma inflicted on hundreds of students who ran for their lives. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, journal entries, social media posts, and the meeting that occurred just hours before the attack. Ethan eventually pled guilty to all counts. In 2023, the judge sentenced him to life without parole, stating that his planning, intent, and choices outweighed any possibility of rehabilitation. But the case didn't end with Ethan. Attention turned to his parents. For the first time in American history, prosecutors filed involuntary manslaughter charges against the parents of a school shooter, arguing that they created the conditions that allowed the attack to happen. Their failures were specific and documented: buying a handgun for a mentally deteriorating teen, not securing the weapon, ignoring explicit warning signs, refusing to remove him from school hours before the shooting, text messages that showed denial instead of responsibility. The prosecution argued that Ethan didn't have to bypass security or defeat a lockbox. The gun was freely accessible, ammunition was freely accessible, and the parents repeatedly dismissed behaviors that would have alarmed any reasonable adult. At one point after the shooting began, Jennifer texted Ethan, "Ethan, don't do it." It was too late. Both parents were convicted in 2024, setting a legal precedent that will be referenced for decades. Their sentencing sent a clear message. Parental negligence in the presence of extreme warning signs can carry a criminal responsibility. From a broader perspective, Ethan's case became a landmark example of how adolescent violence intersects with modern access to firearms, mental illness, and parental responsibility. It forced lawmakers to confront a difficult truth. Some school shootings are preventable if the adults in a teen's life take warning signs seriously. It also highlighted a painful reality for investigators. Ethan showed indicators long before November 30th. He expressed violent thoughts, displayed clear emotional distress, and literally wrote, "Help me," on his schoolwork. But intervention never came. Not from home, not from the system, not from the people closest to him. The Oxford High School shooting reshaped Michigan policy, influenced gun storage legislation, and created one of the most important legal precedents in juvenile justice. Ethan Crumbley is now serving life without parole, and both of his parents are convicted felons. The case remains one of the clearest examples of how multiple systemic failures converged into a preventable tragedy. Next, we move to another teenage shooter whose crime made national headlines for a different reason, not just the attack itself, but the disturbing behavior he displayed in court, the escape that shocked Ohio, and the sentence that ensured he would never leave prison. Number 7, T.J. Lane. When 17-year-old Thomas T.J. Lane walked into Chardon High School on February 27, 2012, he wasn't a student there. He attended an alternative school for troubled teens. But that morning, he arrived wearing a white t-shirt, sat quietly in the cafeteria, and within minutes carried out one of the most infamous school shootings in Ohio's history. What set this case apart wasn't only the violence, but the disturbing behavior he displayed after the crime, turning him into a national symbol of calculated cruelty. Lane grew up in a deeply unstable environment. His childhood was marked by domestic violence, poverty, and a chaotic home life. His father had multiple arrests for assault and abuse. Teachers described TJ as withdrawn, but academically capable, a teen who floated on the edges of social groups. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't bullied either. He simply existed in a quiet, isolated mental space that very few people could access. Beneath this exterior, Lane struggled with depression, anger, and a profound sense of alienation. He bounced between schools, lacked consistent parental support, and frequently acted out in subtle ways that hinted at deeper emotional instability. But there were no clear indicators he was on the trajectory toward mass violence. There was no manifesto, no list of targets, no long sequence of threats. His turning point came silently without warnings, inside a mind that had drifted far from any sense of empathy. On the morning of the shooting, Lane took a .22 caliber handgun and a pocket full of ammunition. He sat down in the cafeteria, watching students gather before the first bell. Then, without speaking, he stood up and opened fire. The victims were not random strangers. Lane knew them. They were students he had grown up around from earlier school years. He shot 6 students as they attempted to flee or dive for cover. 3 of them, Daniel Parmertor, Demetrius Hewlin, and Russell King Jr., died from their injuries. Another was left permanently paralyzed. Lane fled the school immediately after the shooting. Police found him less than a mile away, sitting calmly on a road, the gun still nearby. He surrendered without resisting. Officers later said they were struck by his blank expression, emotionless, detached, as if he were disconnected from the gravity of what had just happened. The investigation moved quickly. Lane confessed, admitted he targeted students he viewed as privileged, and acknowledged planning the attack in advance. Prosecutors charged him as an adult, pointing to his deliberate steps, selecting the time, selecting the location, and firing at close range. But it was the courtroom phase that made this case infamous. At his sentencing hearing, Lane wore a white t-shirt with the word "killer" written across the front in black marker. Instead of remorse, he smirked at the families of the victims. He laughed. He made eye contact deliberately, almost tauntingly. Then he delivered a statement so cold that the courtroom erupted in shock and outrage. He insulted the families, raised his middle finger, and ended with a profanity that made national news. Judges, prosecutors, and even veteran investigators said they had never seen anything like it from any offender, let alone a teenager. His lack of remorse wasn't performative, it was genuine. He wanted the families to feel pain. He wanted the attention. His demeanor removed any remaining possibility of leniency. T.J. Lane received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus additional time for attempted murder. The sentence ensured he would never leave prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2014, 2 years into his sentence, Lane executed a prison escape that stunned the state of Ohio. Along with 2 other inmates, he scaled a 15-foot fence topped with razor wire at Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution. It shouldn't have been possible, but somehow it happened. Lane made it several hundred yards from the facility before being captured. The escape triggered a statewide investigation into security breaches and resulted in disciplinary actions for staff. For the public, the escape confirmed what many already feared. Lane wasn't just violent, he was both intelligent and dangerous, capable of manipulation even behind bars. After the escape, he was transferred to a maximum security facility where he remains today under much tighter supervision. Lane's case left a permanent mark on Ohio. It forced districts to reassess school security. It prompted lawmakers to review mental health interventions for high-risk teens. And it raised an uncomfortable reality. Not every juvenile offender shows signs that others can identify in time to intervene. Sometimes the internal path toward violence is hidden entirely until it manifests. More than a decade later, this case is still discussed not just because of the crime, but because of Lane's chilling courtroom behavior. Where many young offenders later show regret, remorse, or emotional collapse, Lane displayed none. That absence of empathy became one of the defining elements of the case, and one of the reasons prosecutors argued he was among the rare juveniles who demonstrated adult-level intent and adult-level moral awareness. This case also shaped how the public views juvenile life sentences. Courts frequently debate whether teenagers can be rehabilitated, but Lane's actions, both during the murders and after, were used as prime examples of why some offenders are considered so dangerous, so emotionally detached, and so unrepentant that release is never appropriate. Next is a case involving one of the youngest teens on this list, a 13-year-old who committed a school murder that shocked Florida, led to a nationally televised trial, and raised early questions about whether children should ever be tried as adults. Number 8, Nathaniel Brazill. On the last day of school in May 2000, students at Lake Worth Middle School in Florida were expecting an ordinary half-day before summer break. Instead, the year ended with one of the most shocking juvenile homicides in state history. A 13-year-old boy, upset over a suspension, walked back onto campus with a gun and killed a teacher he admired, a tragedy that launched one of the earliest major national debates about trying minors as adults. Nathaniel Brazill grew up in a difficult environment. His household was tense, marked by instability and limited supervision. Teachers described him as intelligent but emotionally fragile, someone who acted impulsively when frustrated. Despite the challenges, he had built strong relationships at school, particularly with his favorite teacher, Barry Grunow, a respected educator known for connecting with troubled students. That connection made what happened next even harder for investigators and the community to understand. The turning path began with a seemingly minor incident. Nathaniel got into trouble for participating in a water balloon fight on campus, something many teens do, but the school cracked down and he was suspended. For most students, this would result in embarrassment or frustration. For Nathaniel, whose emotional stability was already precarious, the suspension triggered a much deeper reaction. After being sent home, he spiraled. Instead of cooling down, he became fixated on the incident and on the adults he believed had embarrassed him. At that point, a critical failure occurred in the home. Nathaniel had access to a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol brought into the house by a family friend. He retrieved it, loaded it, and made the decision that turned a disciplinary problem into a homicide. Nathaniel returned to the school, entering through an area where he could blend in with the remaining staff and students. He first sought out a guidance counselor, waving the gun and demanding access to the people he believed were responsible for his suspension. Several adults managed to calm him enough to walk him toward an exit, but as he was being escorted out, he suddenly broke away and walked toward Mr. Gruno's classroom. Inside the classroom, Gruno saw his former student appear in the doorway. Nathaniel raised the gun and fired a single round into Gruno's face. The teacher fell almost instantly. He died minutes later. Students screamed and fled as teachers rushed to call 911. The shooting lasted seconds, but it left an entire school in shock. Nathaniel did not flee far. He was found shortly after the shooting at the home of a friend, still holding the gun. Officers reported he was crying, confused, and repeatedly asked if Mr. Gruno was going to die, an outcome he may not have fully understood, despite firing the weapon at close range. From a legal perspective, the case raised immediate and complex questions. Nathaniel was only 13. Very few offenders that young had ever been tried for homicide as adults in the United States. Prosecutors had to decide whether this was a moment of impulsive adolescent rage or a deliberate act requiring adult-level accountability. The facts pushed the case toward adult prosecution. Nathaniel went home, obtained a firearm, returned to the school, confronted staff, and ultimately chose to shoot a teacher who had shown nothing but kindness toward him. The planning didn't need to be sophisticated. It only needed to demonstrate intent. And legally, it did. The trial attracted national media attention. ABC, CNN, CBS, and newspapers across the country covered it extensively. Viewers debated whether a 13-year-old could truly understand the consequences of killing someone, whether his family circumstances contributed, and whether the state should prioritize punishment or rehabilitation. In court, prosecutors argued that Nathaniel knew exactly what he was doing. The defense countered that he lacked full emotional development and didn't intend to kill. They pointed to his frantic, panicked state after the shooting, and to the fact that he cried and expressed confusion during police questioning. But the jury focused on what happened before the shooting. He obtained a loaded gun, returned to the school, confronted multiple adults, and ultimately shot a teacher at point-blank range. That level of purposeful action met Florida's threshold for adult sentencing. Nathaniel Brazill was convicted of second-degree murder and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, one of the harshest sentences ever given to a 13-year-old in the country at that time. Under Florida law, he was required to serve 85% of his sentence before becoming eligible for release. The sentence sparked ongoing debate. Some argued it was necessary to reflect the severity of taking a life. Others believed that adolescents have extraordinary potential for rehabilitation and that sentencing a child to nearly 3 decades in prison failed to account for that possibility. For the city of Lake Worth, the tragedy changed school security protocols, teacher-student boundary policies, and firearm safety discussions statewide. It also became a case study in how quickly a troubled teen can escalate from frustration to irreversible violence when firearms are accessible and emotional supports are missing. As for Nathaniel, his case is still referenced in juvenile justice reform discussions. He represents a rare category, an extremely young offender who committed a single, highly emotional homicide in a moment of crisis rather than through long-term planning. Those distinctions continue to influence legal scholars, psychologists, and policymakers examining juvenile sentencing. Next is another Florida teen whose crime shocked the nation years earlier, a 14-year-old who committed one of the most disturbing murders of the 1990s and hid the victim's body in a place investigators still mention as one of the most surreal discoveries they've ever encountered. Number 9. Joshua Phillips. When 14-year-old Joshua Phillips was arrested in Jacksonville, Florida in 1998, investigators described his case as every parent's nightmare. The crime itself was shocking, but what made it unforgettable was the hiding place. A detail so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. For 7 days, the body of an 8-year-old girl lay hidden under Joshua's waterbed while he slept, ate, played video games, and participated in the community search for her. Phillips grew up in what looked like a stable home on the surface. His father was strict, controlling, and feared by both Joshua and his mother. The household operated under rigid rules, and Joshua's father had a zero-tolerance policy for mistakes or disobedience. Friends and neighbors later said Joshua rarely had visitors because his father didn't allow friends inside. The environment didn't show physical chaos, but emotionally it was tense, something that became crucial in understanding Joshua's mindset before the crime. On November 3rd, 1998, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, a friendly neighborhood girl, went outside to play. She knew Joshua casually. They lived only a few houses apart. That afternoon, she bounced a ball toward his yard, and he came outside. This was the beginning of a chain of events that spiraled into one of Florida's most infamous juvenile murders. According to Joshua, the turning moment happened when the two began playing baseball in the yard. Maddie was accidentally hit in the eye with a ball. In his panic, not over her injury, but over how his father would react, Joshua dragged her inside. He later told investigators he feared his father discovering he had broken the rule about having visitors. That fear set the stage for a catastrophic decision. Once inside the house, Joshua attempted to quiet Maddie, who was crying from the injury. He later claimed he hit her with the baseball bat in panic. After that, the crime escalated. Court records show he stabbed her multiple times and ultimately hid her body under his waterbed. What makes this case so disturbing isn't just the violence, but what happened afterward. Instead of fleeing or confessing, Joshua pushed the body into the hollow space under his mattress and sealed the wooden frame. Then he went about his life. That night, he slept on the bed. The next day, he attended school like nothing happened. The entire neighborhood mobilized in a massive search effort. Joshua helped look for Maddie. He stood beside adults, watched news coverage, and stayed silent through it all. His parents were unaware anything was wrong, though his mother later recalled a strange, foul smell from his room that Joshua blamed on wet clothes. The case broke open 7 days later when Joshua's mother, Alyssa Phillips, noticed a leak in his waterbed. While inspecting it, she saw something underneath that made her scream. She ran outside, shaking, and called 911. Police arrived within minutes and discovered Maddie's body. Joshua was taken into custody immediately. During questioning, detectives said he showed confusion, fear, and immaturity, rather than calculated malice. He told them he didn't know what to do, and that everything escalated because he was terrified of his father's reaction. But the prosecution argued that the length of time the body remained hidden and his ability to act normal during the search showed awareness far beyond momentary panic. Joshua was charged as an adult, a decision that reflected the brutality of the crime and the difficulty of explaining it in juvenile court. The trial drew massive national media attention. CBS, 48 Hours, the Associated Press, and outlets across the country covered every detail. The prosecution's argument focused on 3 core points. Joshua had multiple chances to seek help and didn't. The concealment lasted a full week. The violence was extensive, showing deliberate action. The defense countered with psychological evaluations, showing Joshua was emotionally stunted, terrified of his father, and incapable of processing the magnitude of what he had done. They argued the case was rooted in panic, not premeditation, and that Joshua's age should mitigate the sentence. But under Florida law, the brutality and concealment met the threshold for adult responsibility. In 1999, Joshua Phillips was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole, one of the harshest juvenile sentences of its time. Over the years, his case re-entered the spotlight as juvenile sentencing laws evolved. Supreme Court. Rulings in the 2010s limited mandatory life sentences for minors, and Joshua received a resentencing hearing. At the hearing, psychologists, teachers, and staff described him as a model inmate who matured significantly. But Maddie's family opposed release, arguing the crime's gravity demanded permanent imprisonment. In 2017, a judge reaffirmed that Joshua would remain behind bars, though he now has a theoretical possibility of parole far in the future due to legal changes. His case remains a reference point in debates about adolescent psychology, impulsive versus intentional violence, and the appropriateness of adult sentences for juvenile offenders. The Maddie Clifton case is still studied today because it reveals the most unsettling overlap in juvenile crime. A young offender with no history of violence committing an act far beyond what anyone expected, followed by a week of concealment that blurred the line between panic and awareness. Next, we move to a case that predates most of the others, a 15-year-old whose crime involved not only the killing of his parents, but a planned attack at his high school the next morning. This case became one of the most heavily analyzed pre-Columbine shootings in American history. Number 10. Kip Kinkel. When 15-year-old Kip Kinkel carried out a double murder at home and opened fire on his classmates the next morning, investigators said they were looking at one of the most complex juvenile offenders they had ever evaluated. This was May 1998, just under 1 year before Columbine, and the case exposed early warning signs of adolescent mental illness that the system wasn't prepared to handle. The result was one of the deadliest pre-Columbine school attacks in U.S. history, and a lifelong sentence that still sparks debate decades later. Kiplin Philip Kinkel, known as Kip, was born in August 1982 and grew up in Springfield, Oregon. His parents, Bill and Faith Kinkel, were both respected Spanish teachers in the community. Bill had taught at Thurston High School and Lane Community College before retiring 3 years prior to the shooting, while Faith still taught at Springfield High School. According to all accounts, they were loving, supportive parents who engaged deeply in their children's lives. Kip's older sister, Kristen, was a gifted athletic student. The family even spent a sabbatical year in Spain when Kip was 6, where he attended a Spanish-speaking kindergarten. By all outward appearances, they seemed like a stable, nurturing household. But beneath the surface, Kip struggled with profound internal issues from childhood. As he entered his teenage years, he experienced violent, intrusive thoughts, intense paranoia, and persistent auditory hallucinations. He later described hearing 3 distinct voices in his head. Voice A, which commanded him to commit violent acts. Voice B, which repeated insulting and depressive statements. And Voice C, which constantly echoed what the other 2 voices said. He believed the government had implanted a computer chip in his brain and feared that the Chinese were going to invade the West Coast. These weren't typical teenage anxieties. They were symptoms of severe paranoid schizophrenia that would go undiagnosed for years. Kip also developed an intense fascination with weapons and explosives from an early age. He began making bombs, mostly gasoline-based, and detonating them in a nearby quarry to release his anger. His parents, unfamiliar with how to handle such extreme behavior, initially tried to discourage his interest, but eventually his father took a different approach. Bill enrolled Kip in gun safety courses and purchased him firearms, a 9mm Glock handgun and a .22 caliber rifle, believing that if he couldn't stop his son's obsession, he could at least supervise it. Faith initially disapproved, but ultimately relented when Kip's psychologist gave her emotional permission to say yes. Kip's parents did recognize that something was wrong. They enrolled him in anger management and had him evaluated by psychologist Jeffrey Hicks. Over a 6-month period, Kip was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and prescribed Prozac. After 8 weeks, both Kip and his mother agreed with Dr. Hicks that he seemed to be improving, and the therapy sessions ended. But when his Prozac prescription ran out in late 1997, Kip never refilled it. Without treatment, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. The paranoid delusions intensified. The voices grew louder and more demanding. Despite these symptoms, Kip functioned well enough on the surface to avoid triggering full psychiatric intervention. His problems came across as typical teen anger and moodiness, not signs of a deeper psychotic disorder. Teachers observed mood swings and sudden outbursts, but nothing that suggested he was on the brink of catastrophic violence. Classmates described him as strange and morbid, but many troubled teens fit that description. What no one realized was that the internal battle raging inside him was spiraling out of control. The crisis point came on May 20th, 1998. That morning, Kip purchased a stolen Beretta handgun from a friend at school for $110 and hid it in his locker. When the gun's owner reported it missing and police traced it to Thurston High, Kip was arrested at school around 9:15 a.m. and suspended pending expulsion. At 3:00 in the afternoon, his father picked him up from the police station. Bill was furious and threatened to send Kip to boarding school if he didn't change his behavior. Kip sat in the car silently during the ride home, stewing in fear, anger, and humiliation. Once inside the house, his paranoia peaked and the voices intensified. In his distorted mental state, he convinced himself he was sparing his parents the shame of his expulsion and what he believed was inevitable violence. He retrieved the .22 caliber rifle his father had purchased and shot Bill in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Hours later, when his mother Faith returned home from work, Kip was waiting in the garage. He shot her multiple times, killing her as well. He then dragged her body into the house and covered it with a blanket. In the hours that followed, he wrote a rambling, suicide-style note expressing hatred for himself, apologizing, and describing his mental torment. But instead of taking his own life, he spent the night in the house with his parents' bodies. The next morning, May 21st, 1998, Kip drove his mother's car to Thurston High School. He arrived around 7:50 a.m. wearing a trench coat and carrying an arsenal, 2 handguns, his father's Ruger .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, a knife, and more than 1,200 rounds of ammunition. He first shot 2 students in a hallway. Ryan Atterbury survived, but 16-year-old Ben Walker would later die at the hospital. Kip then walked into the cafeteria, which was filled with approximately 200 students just starting their day. He opened fire, getting off approximately 50 rounds and hitting 37 people. 17-year-old Mikael Nicolason died at the scene. 25 other students were wounded, some critically. Chaos erupted instantly as students scrambled for cover, many not immediately realizing the gun was real. But unlike many school shootings, this one didn't end with the shooter's suicide or police intervention. When Kip's rifle ran out of ammunition and he paused to reload, 17-year-old Jake Riker, who had just been shot in the chest himself and watched his girlfriend get hit, heard the distinctive click of an empty magazine. Without thinking, Jake tackled Kip around the waist. Kip drew his Glock pistol and fired, hitting Jake in the left index finger. But by then, Jake's 14-year-old brother Josh, along with Adam Wahlberger, Doug Ure, and David Ure, had joined the struggle. Together, 7 students subdued and disarmed Kinkel, holding him down while he screamed, "Just kill me, shoot me now." When police arrived and arrested him, Kip wasn't finished. He retrieved a knife secured to his leg and attacked an officer, begging to be fatally shot. The officer subdued him with pepper spray. Jake Riker, despite his perforated lung, made a full recovery. He later received the Boy Scouts Honor Medal with crossed palms for his heroism, the second highest honor in scouting. What investigators discovered at the Kinkel home solidified their understanding of Kip's mental state. His notebooks revealed a teen in deep psychological crisis, paranoid, delusional, terrified of the world, and convinced he had no control over the voices commanding him. He had written about feeling worthless, about fantasies of mass violence, and about not wanting to live. The attack wasn't driven by revenge against specific individuals or targeting bullies. It was the catastrophic result of untreated severe mental illness combined with easy access to weapons. The legal proceedings centered on 2 competing realities. Kip had clearly planned the attacks, but he also suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia. Defense experts argued he was deeply psychotic during the crimes. Prosecutors argued he knew right from wrong. He hid evidence, wrote notes, and attempted to reload strategically during the shooting. Oregon's insanity defense is extremely narrow, and Kip didn't meet its legal criteria. In September 1999, just days before his trial was set to begin, Kip pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated murder and 26 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence. He was 16 years old. Years later, his case resurfaced as juvenile sentencing laws evolved nationwide. Critics argued that a boy suffering from severe, undiagnosed schizophrenia at age 12 should not be held to adult standards of culpability. Others countered that the scale of destruction and the degree of planning showed he understood the consequences and that public safety required permanent incarceration. When Oregon passed legislation potentially allowing juvenile offenders sentenced to life terms a chance at parole, it was specifically amended to exclude cases like Kip's. Judges repeatedly upheld his sentence. In 2021, Kip Kinkel broke his 23-year silence in an interview with HuffPost, expressing tremendous shame and guilt for what he had done. He said he declined most interview requests out of respect for his victims and their families, acknowledging that the sound of my voice may cause additional and unnecessary trauma. He reflected on how his case has been used to oppose juvenile justice reform and expressed guilt that his silence may have harmed other young offenders seeking second chances. Today, Kip Kinkel remains one of the most studied juvenile offenders in forensic psychology. His case is taught in universities, analyzed in medical journals, and referenced in debates about mental health, gun access, and juvenile justice. What makes his story so haunting isn't only the scale of the violence, it's the missed warning signs. He openly discussed hearing voices. His parents tried to manage his behavior, but lacked understanding of severe mental illness. Teachers saw concerning behavior, but nothing that triggered intervention. The system failed to recognize that a deeply troubled teenager with untreated schizophrenia and access to firearms was a tragedy waiting to happen. Kip Kinkel's case stands as a harsh reminder that adolescent violence is often the endpoint of a long, invisible spiral, one that, in this case, no one recognized in time to prevent catastrophe.